Go on then, Julian Thorne sneered, a dismissive flick of his wrist towards the magnificent grand piano. If you truly believe you can interpret it better than I just did, by all means, grace us with your genius. Ilara felt the familiar burn of humiliation, her gaze fixed on the gleaming ebony. You serious? You want me to play that? Here? This is the moment a small-town woman, whose life had been systematically dismantled by a system meant to protect, was challenged by the world's most celebrated pianist. His intention was to mock, to underscore her perceived insignificance in a room full of power brokers and self-important philanthropists. But what unfolded next transcended the confines of that opulent hall, revealing a buried talent, a forgotten voice, and the raw, unyielding heart of a community fighting for its very survival. It was a symphony of defiance, a melody of hope, and a testament to the fact that true genius often blossoms where least expected, leaving everyone, most of all the cynical maestro, utterly stunned. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. Go on then, Julian Thorne sneered, a dismissive flick of his wrist towards the magnificent grand piano. If you truly believe you can interpret it better than I just did, by all means, grace us with your genius. Ilara felt the familiar burn of humiliation, her gaze fixed on the gleaming ebony. You serious? You want me to play that? Here? The words hung in the air, thick with the cloying scent of lilies and unspoken judgments. Around them, the hushed murmurs of the gala's attendees had swelled into a low, anticipatory hum, like bees around a hive of unexpected drama. Ilara stood frozen, a quiet storm raging behind her eyes. Her worn navy dress, the best she owned, felt like a costume in this cathedral of polished marble and designer suits. She was a flicker amidst 1,000 chandeliers, a forgotten note in a meticulously orchestrated symphony. Her hands, calloused from years of working in the community garden and mending the tears in her neighbors' lives, trembled imperceptibly. They were not the hands Julian Thorne had just displayed, long, elegant, flawlessly manicured, dancing across the keys with a precision that bordered on the clinical. His rendition of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major had been technically perfect, emotionally hollow. It was a performance, not a prayer. But who was she to judge? She was Ilara Vance, a ghost haunting the edges of a life she once dreamed of, a relic of a passion long buried beneath the weight of responsibility and heartbreak. She was here tonight, in the grand ballroom of the opulent Havenwood Civic Center, not by choice, but by obligation. This so-called Havenwood Renewal Gala was a cynical spectacle, a thinly veiled attempt by Sterling Industries, the very corporation poisoning their town's soil and water, to whitewash their image. Julian Thorne, the celebrated classical pianist, was their celebrity pawn, brought in to lend an air of legitimacy to their deceit. He had played his set, accepted the fawning praise, and then, in a moment of utterly unbridled arrogance, had spotted Ilara in the sparse crowd of actual Havenwood residents, a group Sterling Industries had reluctantly invited to feign inclusivity. He'd seen her reaction, a subtle flinch perhaps, at his soulless interpretation of a piece she knew intimately, a piece that once sang through her very bones, and he, in his magnificent hubris, had taken it as a challenge. Havenwood. The name itself was a cruel irony. It had once been a haven, a verdant valley cradled by ancient oaks, where the river ran clear and the laughter of children echoed through the winding streets. Now, a low, metallic tang often hung in the air, a constant reminder of the sprawling sterling plant on the outskirts of town. Cancer rates had spiked, the local doctor's office was overwhelmed, and the once vibrant community was slowly, painfully being choked. Ilara had fought, along with others, to bring attention to their plight, to hold Sterling accountable. But money spoke louder than truth, and their voices, like hers, had been systematically silenced. "Well?" Julian pressed, his smile a thin, cruel line. "Cat got your tongue or merely your talent?" A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the crowd. This was entertainment for them, a minor amusement before dessert. Ilara's mind raced, a whirlwind of ancient fears and dormant desires. Her fingers, those same hands now trembling, had once flown across keys with a similar, if less public, grace. The old upright in her childhood home had been her sanctuary, her voice when words failed. Her mother, a gentle soul with a keen ear, had nurtured that gift, whispering about concert halls and grand stages. But then life, in its brutal indifference, had intervened. The piano fell silent. The dreams turned to dust. I don't think that's appropriate," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper against the ballroom's acoustics. Her gaze swept over the faces in the crowd, landing on Mrs. Gable, a kind, elderly woman from her street whose eyes held a deep, knowing sorrow. Mrs. Gable's grandson, just 7 years old, was in the hospital, another victim of Havenwood's poisoned legacy. And then she saw David, a young activist she worked with, his jaw tight, a silent plea in his eyes. "Don't let him win. Don't let him make a joke of us." A sudden, sharp anger, cold and clear like the mountain springs Havenwood once boasted, pierced through Ilara's decades-long shroud of resignation. This wasn't just about her, or Julian Thorne's insufferable ego. This was about Havenwood. This was about every person whose life had been dismissed, whose suffering had been ignored, whose dignity had been trampled underfoot by the very kind of power Julian Thorne represented. The injustice, sharp and immediate, tasted metallic on her tongue, echoing the taste of the very air they breathed in Havenwood. Her gaze lifted, meeting Julian's challenging stare head-on. The tremor in her hands stilled. A spark, long dormant, ignited deep within her. It was a spark of defiance, of memory, of a forgotten passion demanding to be heard. "Fine," Ilara said, her voice still quiet, but imbued with a steel that startled even her. She began to walk, slowly, deliberately, towards the gleaming grand piano. Each step felt like a drumbeat, echoing in the sudden, complete silence of the ballroom. The air crackled with a strange, almost electric tension. Julian Thorne's smirk faltered slightly. He hadn't expected her to accept. No one had. She reached the piano, its polished surface reflecting the chandeliers above, creating a dazzling, intimidating constellation. The stool felt cold beneath her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her fingers hovering above the pristine ivory keys, memories flooding her. A small girl, a worn upright, a mother's gentle encouragement. This wasn't just a piano, it was a conduit, a vessel for a lifetime of unexpressed sorrow, silent anger, and dormant hope. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Ilara Vance let her fingers descend, pressing gently, reverently, against the first key. The note that emerged, pure and resonant, seemed to hold the very heart of Havenwood within its trembling sound, a sound Julian Thorne had never coaxed from his flawless technique, and one that promised to shake the very foundations of his preconceived notions, and perhaps the entire town. The note that emerged, pure and resonant, seemed to hold the very heart of Havenwood within its trembling sound. It wasn't the opening flourish of Chopin's Nocturne, not exactly. It was something far more ancient, more raw. Ilara's fingers, instead of tracing the delicate, familiar arpeggios, found a different path, a hesitant, almost mournful chord. It was a lament, a deep, resonant cry that seemed to sink into the very marrow of the listener's bones, silencing the last vestiges of polite chatter. Julian Thorne, who had leaned back in his chair with a smug, expectant smirk, now leaned forward, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features. He recognized the classical influence, the architectural structure, but the soul was entirely Ilara's. She played with a tentative grace at first, as if reacquainting herself with a long-lost lover. Each note was a breath, each chord a sigh. Her eyes, half closed, were seeing not the opulent ballroom, but the winding river of Havenwood, choked with industrial waste. She was seeing Mrs. Gable's grandson, pale and weak in his hospital bed. She was seeing the faded dreams of her neighbors, the silent protests, the defiant spirit that refused to break. The music shifted, growing bolder. The tentative lament gave way to a surge of quiet defiance, a melody that whispered of resilience. It wasn't a showy piece, no virtuosic runs or thunderous crescendos. Instead, it was an intimate conversation, a narrative woven through sound. A delicate, high refrain, reminiscent of a child's laughter, was abruptly interrupted by a dissonance, sharp and jarring, a stark representation of the abrupt end to their innocence. Then, a slower, heavier passage emerged, weighty with sorrow, mimicking the oppressive cloud that hung over Havenwood. Across the room, David, the young activist, felt a tear escape and trail down his cheek. This wasn't just music. It was their story, played on a stage they'd never dared to dream of. He watched Ilara, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as if she were singing along with the silent lyrics of her heart. He'd known she was artistic, had seen the sketches she'd made for the protest banners, but this was an entirely different dimension of her being. Julian Thorne's face was a study in conflicted emotions. His finely honed musical ear picked up on the technical prowess, the utterly unique phrasing, the emotional depth that had been absent from his own flawless performance just minutes earlier. He saw the way Ilara's shoulders tensed on certain notes, the way her entire body seemed to pour itself into the music. This wasn't learned, it was lived. The arrogance that usually defined him began to recede, replaced by a grudging respect, and then something akin to envy. How could a woman he'd dismissed as a commoner, a mere agitator, possess such an unvarnished, powerful gift? The music reached a crescendo, not of volume, but of raw feeling. It was a furious, passionate outpouring, a cry for justice that resonated through the room. It spoke of betrayal and broken promises, of a community fighting for its right to breathe clean air and drink pure water. It was the sound of Havenwood's beating heart, defiant and unbroken. Then, just as abruptly, the fury subsided, giving way to a hopeful, soaring melody, fragile yet persistent, like a wildflower pushing through cracked pavement. It was a promise, a prayer, a plea. When her hands finally lifted from the keys, the last note echoing into silence, the air in the ballroom was thick with something more potent than perfume. It was raw emotion. No one applauded immediately. They simply sat, stunned, caught in the aftermath of Ilara's soul-bearing performance. Mrs. Gable was openly weeping, not tears of sorrow, but of profound recognition. Even the Sterling Industries executives, usually so impervious, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces uncharacteristically pale. Julian Thorne was the first to move. He slowly rose from his chair, his gaze fixed on Alara. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, almost reverent awe. He began to walk towards her, a heavy silence hanging in his wake. Each step he took felt like a seismic shift, altering the landscape of the evening, perhaps even the future. Ilara, her chest heaving, her fingers still tingling from the electric charge of the keys, watched him approach. She braced herself for more mockery, for some cutting remark that would undermine the vulnerability she had just laid bare. But when he stopped before her, his blue eyes, usually so cold, were alight with an unfamiliar fire. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice devoid of its usual condescension. And that wasn't Chopin, not entirely. That was an elegy, a battle cry, and a symphony of hope, all rolled into one. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the silent, rapt faces in the room. "And you played it, not with technique, but with truth." He extended a hand, not to shake hers, but to gesture towards the piano. "You must tell me. What was that piece? And why have I never heard it before?" Ilara took a shaky breath. It's the Song of Havenwood," she replied, her voice still hoarse with emotion. "And you haven't heard it before, Mr. Thorne, because nobody ever listened." A murmur went through the crowd. Sterling Industries CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, Julian's distant cousin, stood up abruptly, his face a mask of displeasure. "I believe that's quite enough, Ms. Vance. We appreciate your unique contribution, but perhaps it's time to move on to the next item on our agenda." His tone was sharp, an attempt to regain control of a narrative that had spiraled wildly out of his grasp. But Julian Thorne ignored him, his eyes still fixed on Ilara, a strange intensity burning within them. "No, Marcus," he said, his voice carrying surprising authority, cutting through the CEO's interruption. "We are not moving on. Not yet. This woman has just played a piece of music that speaks more eloquently than any speech, any protest. She has given voice to the voiceless." He turned to the crowd, his gaze challenging them all. "And if what I heard is true, if this Havenwood is indeed suffering, then it is not just her story. It is our responsibility." He paused, then turned back to Ilara, a new resolve hardening his features. "Ms. Vance, I have a proposal, one that will either bring Havenwood the attention it deserves or expose the depth of its struggle to the entire world." The weight of his words hung in the stunned silence, a sudden, unexpected fork in the road, promising either salvation or an even greater, more public despair. "Ms. Vance, I have a proposal, one that will either bring Havenwood the attention it deserves or expose the depth of its struggle to the entire world." Julian Thorne's words, sharp and clear, cut through the silence like a maestro's baton. The air crackled with anticipation, a collective holding of breath from the assembled guests. Ilara felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just an offer. It was a precipice, a leap of faith into the unknown, carrying the hopes and fears of her entire community. Marcus Thorne, Sterling Industries CEO, finally found his voice, sputtering, "Julian, what on earth are you doing? This is utterly inappropriate. We have a schedule, donors to acknowledge, an image to uphold." His face was blotchy with suppressed rage, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before everyone. Julian, however, didn't even glance at his cousin. His gaze remained fixed on Ilara, intense and unyielding. "My proposal, Ms. Vance, is this. I will arrange a benefit concert, a global broadcast event, here in Havenwood. You will be the featured performer, playing your Song of Havenwood. I will conduct a small ensemble, lending my name and reputation to the cause. Every penny raised will go directly to a fund to support Havenwood's residents, to fight for cleaner water, for medical aid, for whatever your community needs to heal. But there's a catch." Ilara's heart pounded. A global broadcast? Her on stage again after all these years? It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly unbelievable. "A catch?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Julian continued, his voice dropping slightly, lending an air of conspiracy to his words. "The catch is this. Sterling Industries will fight us. They will discredit you, discredit Havenwood, discredit the entire notion that their operations are harmful. They will try to silence us. This will become a public battle, not just a concert. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for your story and Havenwood's story to be laid bare for the world, controversies and all?" The weight of his words settled on Ilara like a physical burden. Marcus Thorne looked apoplectic, his hands clenching into fists. David, standing near Mrs. Gable, watched Ilara with bated breath, his hope palpable. The entire ballroom felt like a pressure cooker, on the verge of exploding. Ilara thought of the faces she knew, the children whose laughter had grown too quiet, the elders whose eyes held too much pain. She thought of her own silent sacrifice, the music she had locked away for so long. This wasn't just about her fear of the stage. It was about exposing the raw wounds of her home, pitting their fragile community against a corporate giant. But wasn't that what they had been trying to do all along, only without the international spotlight? Her gaze flickered to Mrs. Gable, whose eyes, though still tear-stained, held a fierce, unspoken encouragement. Then to David, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They were ready. She had to be ready. "Yes," Ilara said, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. "I am prepared. Havenwood is prepared. We have nothing left to lose, Mr. Thorne, and everything to gain." A collective gasp went through the room. Julian Thorne offered her a small, tight smile, a glimmer of something akin to admiration in his eyes. Then it settled. "We have work to do." He turned to face the stunned audience, his arm sweeping dramatically towards Ilara and then encompassing the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight you witnessed not just music, but a testament to the human spirit. And in the coming weeks, the world will hear it too." Marcus Thorne erupted. "This is preposterous. Julian, you cannot simply hijack a Sterling Industries gala to stage a personal vendetta. Your contract—" "My contract, Marcus, stipulates my artistic freedom. And my conscience," Julian interjected, his voice cold, "stipulates that I cannot stand idly by when I witness injustice. Consider this my notice. I will no longer endorse Sterling Industries, and I will dedicate my resources to uncovering the truth about Havenwood." The words sent shockwaves through the opulent hall. Executives whispered furiously, philanthropists looked bewildered, and the few Havenwood residents present exchanged glances of disbelief and dawning hope. This was a direct, public declaration of war against Sterling Industries, delivered by their own sponsored celebrity. That night, Ilara returned to her small, quiet cottage in Havenwood, her head spinning. The familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled her lungs, a comforting anchor after the surreal glitz of the gala. David was waiting for her on her porch, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. You did it, Ilara. You actually did it, he exclaimed, rushing to hug her, a rare burst of unrestrained joy. Julian Thorne, a global concert. This is huge. This is everything we've been fighting for. Ilara, still reeling, felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a daunting sense of terror. It's also terrifying, David. What if we fail? What if Sterling is too powerful? David's smile softened. We won't fail, not now, not with Julian Thorne on our side, and certainly not with you leading the charge. That music tonight, it was like a living thing, Ilara. It brought everything home. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Julian Thorne, true to his word, became a force of nature. His publicist, a formidable woman named Vivian, descended upon Havenwood, orchestrating interviews, press conferences, and media appearances with ruthless efficiency. Ilara found herself thrust into the spotlight she had meticulously avoided for decades. She spoke to reporters, her voice initially shaky, but gaining strength as she recounted Havenwood's struggles, the rising illness, the unresponsive pleas to Sterling Industries. Julian, meanwhile, meticulously reviewed Ilara's Song of Havenwood, dissecting its structure, identifying its emotional core, and discussing arrangements for a small orchestra to complement her solo performance. He was a demanding taskmaster, but his criticisms were always rooted in a profound respect for her talent. In the quiet intensity of their shared musical world, a strange, unexpected bond began to form between the renowned maestro and the quiet activist. He saw the fire in her, the deep well of emotion, and she, beneath his polished exterior, sensed a genuine desire for truth, perhaps even a flicker of regret for his past indifference. Their initial meetings, often in Ilara's humble living room, were charged with a complex blend of artistic collaboration and simmering tension. Julian's presence, so grand and self-assured, filled the small space. He would pace, hands behind his back, listening intently as Ilara played, stopping her with a sharp, "No, not like that. That passage, it's a lament, not an accusation. Feel the sorrow, Ilara, not just the anger." One afternoon, as Ilara struggled with a particularly poignant section, her frustration mounted. "It's easy for you to say, Julian," she snapped, her voice trembling. "You haven't lived it. You haven't watched your neighbors sicken, seen your town slowly die. It is an accusation." Julian stopped his pacing, his eyes softening slightly. He sat beside her on the piano bench, his proximity surprisingly intimate. "Perhaps not, Ilara, but I have felt regret. Deep, consuming regret for the times I chose fame over truth, comfort over conscience. And now I hear your music, and I realize that perhaps this is my chance for redemption. For your redemption." His hand, the same hand that had mockingly gestured her to the piano, now gently touched her shoulder. The touch sent a jolt through Ilara, an unexpected connection that transcended their professional alliance. It was a shared vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of the steep price of their past choices. Their combined efforts began to stir a hornet's nest. News of the benefit concert spread like wildfire, forcing Sterling Industries onto the defensive. Marcus Thorne held press conferences denying all allegations, presenting falsified environmental reports, and painting Ilara and Julian as disgruntled opportunists. He threatened legal action, vowing to crush their malicious slander. The stakes were escalating, the battle lines sharply drawn. One evening, as Ilara returned home from a long day of rehearsals and interviews, she found her front door ajar. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Inside, her small living room was in disarray. Papers from her activist files were scattered, furniture overturned. And then she saw it, scrawled crudely on her piano's lid, a chilling message. Silence, or else. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a threat to her. It was a threat to the music, to Havenwood's very voice. And suddenly, she understood the true cost of Julian's dangerous alliance. The game had irrevocably changed, and they were playing for far higher stakes than either of them had ever imagined. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a threat to her. It was a threat to the music, to Havenwood's very voice. Scrawled crudely on her piano's lid, the stark message, silence or else, pulsed in the dim light, a stark warning against the hope she dared to carry. Ilara stood paralyzed in her living room. The overturned furniture and scattered papers, a grotesque tableau of invasion. The silence after her discovery was deafening, amplified by the frantic beat of her own heart. She felt a primal surge of fear, quickly followed by a cold, searing anger. Sterling Industries wasn't just fighting them with words and lawyers anymore. They were stooping to intimidation. She immediately called David. His voice, usually so calm, sharpened with alarm as she recounted the scene. "Stay put, Ilara. Don't touch anything. I'm coming over, and I'm calling Julian." Within minutes, David was there, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. He pulled out his phone, documenting everything with furious precision. "They want to scare you," he muttered, his jaw tight. "They want you to back down, but we won't let them." Julian Thorne arrived shortly after, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a look of barely contained fury. He took in the ransacked room, his gaze lingering on the ominous message on the piano. His hand clenched into a fist. "Marcus," he breathed, the name a venomous curse. "He's gone too far." "It's just a warning," Ilara said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "They want to intimidate us." Julian shook his head, his eyes glinting dangerously. "This is more than a warning, Ilara. This is a declaration that they see you as a serious threat. And if they're willing to do this, who knows what they'll do next?" He looked at her, his concern palpable. "We need to go to the police." Reporting the incident to Havenwood's small police force felt like a futile exercise. Officer Miller, a kind but overwhelmed man, listened patiently, nodding sympathetically. But his eyes held a weary resignation. "Ms. Vance, I understand your concern, but there's no forced entry. It looks like a message, maybe. Hard to prove who did it. And frankly, Sterling Industries has a lot of influence in this town." He promised to patrol more frequently, but Ilara knew it was an empty gesture. The unseen hand of Sterling Industries stretched far, even into the local law enforcement. The incident, however, had an unexpected effect on Ilara. Instead of crushing her spirit, it solidified her resolve. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce protectiveness for Havenwood and an unwavering determination to give voice to its suffering. The music, which had once felt like a burden, now pulsed within her, a weapon against the injustice. Rehearsals for the benefit concert intensified. Julian pushed her harder than ever, demanding not just technical perfection, but an even deeper emotional resonance. He understood now that this wasn't just a performance. It was a crusade. They moved the rehearsals to the old, abandoned Havenwood High School auditorium, a symbolic location that had once been the heart of the community, now decaying just like much of the town. The acoustics were terrible, the piano out of tune, but the atmosphere was electric. Julian brought in a small, hand-picked ensemble of musicians, all renowned in their own right, who had agreed to participate out of respect for Julian and a growing awareness of Havenwood's plight. They were initially skeptical of Alara, a virtual unknown, but her raw talent, coupled with the profound story woven into her music, quickly won them over. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling rehearsal, Alara found herself struggling with a complex bridge. Her fingers stumbled, her concentration fractured by the lingering fear from the break-in. Julian stopped the music abruptly. "Alara, what's wrong? You're holding back. I need you to give me everything. Havenwood needs you to give everything." Tears welled in her eyes. "It's hard, Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking. It's so much. The pressure, the threats, the fear for everyone. Sometimes it feels like they're winning." Julian walked over to her, his expression unusually gentle. He placed a hand over hers on the piano keys. "Fear is a powerful enemy, Alara, but it's also a powerful fuel. Let it feed your music. Let it fuel your resolve. This isn't just about playing notes. It's about telling a story that must be heard. Every dissonant chord, every soaring melody, every silence. It's all a part of Havenwood. Don't run from the pain. Transform it." His words and the surprising warmth of his hand steadied her. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time saw not just a world-renowned musician, but a man profoundly changed by the truth. A man willing to put his career on the line for a cause he now believed in. In that moment, the lines between mentor and student, between celebrity and activist, blurred into something deeper, something profoundly human. News of the upcoming concert and Julian Thorne's public break with Sterling Industries continued to dominate headlines. The mainstream media, initially cautious, picked up on the escalating drama. Sterling Industries, under the direction of Marcus Thorne, launched a ruthless smear campaign. They leaked fabricated stories about Alara's past, twisting her personal tragedies into signs of instability. They accused Julian of being an egomaniac seeking a new form of celebrity. The battle was no longer confined to Havenwood. It was playing out on the national stage. One particularly vicious tabloid piece claimed Alara was a failed musician whose career ended due to unresolved emotional issues, implying mental instability. It was a thinly veiled attack, designed to undermine her credibility and turn public opinion against her. Alara felt a wave of nausea. "They're trying to silence me before I even get on stage," she murmured, clutching the newspaper. "Then we will be louder," Julian said, his voice hard. "Vivian is already working on a counter-narrative. We will fight fire with fire." David, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to gather irrefutable evidence against Sterling Industries. He interviewed dozens of Havenwood residents, meticulously documenting their illnesses, collecting medical reports, and cross-referencing them with the dates of Sterling's increased operations. He even found a former Sterling employee, a disgruntled engineer, who was willing to come forward with internal documents proving the company's deliberate disregard for environmental regulations. It was a dangerous game, but they were running out of time. As the concert date loomed, the pressure mounted. Security concerns became paramount after another, more direct threat arrived at Alara's home, an anonymous letter with a single unburnt match and the words, "Next time, it won't be a warning." Julian insisted on hiring private security, transforming Alara's quiet cottage into a guarded compound. The night before the concert, Alara found herself pacing her living room, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The silence of the house, usually a comfort, now felt heavy with foreboding. She walked over to the piano, her fingers tracing the keys where the threat had been scrawled. She thought of Havenwood, of the hopes now resting on her shoulders. She thought of Julian, of his unexpected loyalty, his belief in her. She sat down, her hands finding the familiar ivory. Instead of her Song of Havenwood, she began to play a slow, mournful hymn, a melody her mother used to hum. It was a prayer, a plea for strength, for courage. As the final notes faded, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of fear. It was a tear of fierce determination. She would not be silenced. She could not be silenced. For Havenwood, she would play. But as she looked at the calendar, a terrifying realization struck her. The concert was tomorrow, and Sterling Industries would stop at nothing to ensure it never happened. The concert was tomorrow, and Sterling Industries would stop at nothing to ensure it never happened. Ilara's hand, still resting on the piano keys, trembled with the weight of that truth. The hymn she had just played faded into the chilling silence of her living room, replaced by the frantic beating of her heart. A sharp rap on the front door startled her. Her new security detail, a burly man named Frank, was already there, peering through the peephole. "It's Mr. Thorne, Ms. Vance," he announced, his voice a low rumble. Julian swept in, his face etched with a tension that mirrored her own. "Ilara, we have a problem, a major one." He didn't wait for her to ask, launching straight into it. "Vivian just got word. Sterling Industries has filed an emergency injunction. They're claiming the Havenwood High Auditorium is structurally unsound and a public safety hazard. They're trying to shut down the concert less than 24 hours before showtime." Ilara felt a cold dread wash over her. "But that's a lie. We had engineers inspect it just last week. It's old, but it's safe." "Of course it's a lie," Julian retorted, pacing her small living room like a caged tiger. "But they've leveraged their political connections. A judge, who coincidentally has ties to Sterling, signed off on it. The local authorities are already on their way to seal off the auditorium." David, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, stepped forward, his eyes blazing. "This is dirty, even for them. They're desperate. It means our evidence is getting too close." He slammed his fist onto the kitchen counter. "What do we do, Julian? We can't let them win now." Julian ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "Vivian is already contacting our legal team, but overturning an emergency injunction overnight is nearly impossible. They've played their hand perfectly." He stopped pacing, turning to Ilara, his gaze intense. "We have two choices. We concede, and Havenwood loses its voice. Or we find another venue. Immediately." "Another venue?" Ilara whispered, the idea seeming utterly ludicrous. "Where? In a town this size, everything is either owned by Sterling or too small, or too dilapidated. We need a space large enough for the ensemble, for the broadcast equipment, and most importantly, for the people of Havenwood to attend," Julian stated, already thinking strategically. "It has to be tonight. If we don't secure a location before dawn, the broadcast teams will pull out, the musicians will leave, and the momentum will be lost." A desperate silence descended. David, ever the pragmatist, was already scrolling through his phone, looking up old community centers, forgotten halls. "Everything's either condemned or booked," he mumbled, frustration clear in his voice. Suddenly, Ilara's eyes fell on an old, framed photograph on her mantelpiece. It was a sepia-toned image of the Havenwood town square, bustling with people, a brass band playing on a small gazebo in the center. And behind the gazebo, towering proudly, stood the old Havenwood clock tower, its base wide and sturdy, surrounded by a broad, paved area. The town square, she breathed, the words escaping her lips before she fully formed the thought. The old clock tower. We could set up there. It's open air, no building codes, no Sterling Industries ownership. It's public land. Julian's eyes widened, a spark of hope igniting within them. Brilliant, Ilara. It's unconventional, yes, but symbolically powerful. The heart of Havenwood. But the logistics, power, sound, seating, protection from the elements. He began to list the challenges, but his voice held a newfound energy. We make it work, David interjected, his eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. We call everyone, every volunteer, every friend, every person who believes in Havenwood. We set up lights, we rent generators, we bring chairs from homes. We make this happen. For Mrs. Gable, for her grandson, for everyone. The decision was made. The next few hours were a frantic blur of phone calls, frantic planning, and a rallying cry that swept through Havenwood like wildfire. David activated their volunteer network. Word spread from neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend. The concert wasn't just moving, it was transforming into a collective act of defiance. Julian, ever the strategist, leveraged his contacts. Within an hour, Vivian was on the phone, coordinating with broadcast teams to reroute their equipment, securing portable generators, and arranging for a makeshift stage to be erected around the base of the clock tower. His reputation, once built on artistic prowess, was now being wielded as a powerful tool for social justice. Ilara found herself swept up in the whirlwind, a strange mix of terror and exhilarating purpose coursing through her. She supervised volunteers carrying chairs, helped string up makeshift lights, and directed technicians setting up sound equipment. The town square, usually quiet and sparsely populated, became a hive of activity, buzzing with a desperate, unified energy. As the first sliver of dawn painted the sky, bathing the clock tower in a soft, ethereal light, Ilara stood in the center of the square, surveying the transformation. A small stage now stood proudly beneath the towering clock, surrounded by rows of mismatched chairs, some borrowed, some old, but all filled with silent purpose. Generators hummed softly in the distance, ready to power their voice. Havenwood was building its own stage, reclaiming its own narrative. One chair, one wire, one act of defiance at a time. Julian walked up beside her, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. "It's beautiful, Ilara," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "A testament to what a community can do when pushed to the brink." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "But this also means Marcus Thorne will be furious. He will see this as a direct challenge, an even greater humiliation. He will retaliate. Are you ready for whatever comes next?" Ilara looked out at the square, at the sleeping town beginning to stir, at the determined faces of the volunteers working tirelessly. She thought of the silence or else message, the unburnt match. She knew the stakes were impossibly high, but she also knew that Havenwood had already lost so much. They had nothing left to lose but their silence. "Yes, Julian," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "I am ready." But as the day progressed, a new, sinister threat began to manifest. News reports flashed across local channels. Severe weather warning issued for Havenwood, potential for flash floods and high winds. The sky, which had dawned clear and hopeful, was now beginning to churn, dark clouds gathering ominously on the horizon. Sterling Industries had been defeated on the legal front, but it seemed fate, or perhaps a more insidious force, was conspiring against them. The concert was hours away, and a storm of epic proportions was brewing, threatening to silence Havenwood's song forever. The concert was hours away, and a storm of epic proportions was brewing, threatening to silence Havenwood's song forever. Alara stared at the television screen in the makeshift green room, a cramped, borrowed office above the town's general store, as the weather reporter's grim forecast echoed her deepest fears. The sky outside, once a hopeful canvas of dawn, now roiled with bruised purple clouds, a malevolent bruise spreading across the horizon. "They're trying to shut us down, one way or another," David muttered, pacing the small room. "First the injunction, now this. It's almost too convenient." His eyes, usually bright with fierce determination, were clouded with a new kind of worry. Julian, his face a mask of grim resolve, walked over to the window, peering out at the darkening sky. "Coincidence or not, we have to prepare. Vivienne, check with the broadcast team. Can they still go live in these conditions? What are the safety protocols?" He turned to Alara, his gaze softening slightly. "Alara, are you okay?" Alara felt a strange calm settle over her amidst the chaos. She had faced down Sterling Industries' threats, resurrected a long-buried dream, and now, a storm. What else could they throw at them? "I'm here, Julian," she said, her voice steady. "We've come too far to turn back because of a little rain." "This isn't a little rain, Alara," he cautioned, his eyes scanning the tumultuous sky. "This is a severe weather event. High winds, flash floods. The stage, the equipment, the audience. It could be dangerous." As if on cue, the first fat drops of rain splattered against the window pane, followed by a low rumble of thunder that vibrated through the floorboards. Outside, the volunteers, who had been meticulously arranging chairs and securing cables, scattered, rushing to cover sensitive equipment with tarps. The festive atmosphere of preparation quickly dissolved into a frantic scramble against the elements. David got off the phone, his face pale. "The local weather service is upgrading the warning. They're recommending everyone seek shelter. They might even issue an evacuation order." Panic began to ripple through Havenwood. Cars, which had been slowly filling the side streets in anticipation of the concert, now turned and headed out of town. The early attendees, mostly Havenwood residents, huddled under awnings, their faces etched with disappointment and fear. It felt like history repeating itself. Every time Havenwood tried to rise, an unseen force pushed it back down. Alara walked out onto the porch of the general store, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She saw Mrs. Gable standing near the town square, clutching a thin shawl around her, her eyes fixed on the makeshift stage. Even in the face of the encroaching storm, there was a quiet defiance in her stance, a silent plea for hope. "We can't stop now," Alara said, turning back to Julian and David, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. "Not when they're expecting us. Not when they need to hear our song more than ever." Julian met her gaze, his own internal battle raging. His professional instincts screamed caution, safety protocols, reputation. But the man who had unexpectedly found redemption in Havenwood's struggle now saw something deeper. He saw the resilience in Alara's eyes, the unwavering spirit of a community that refused to be silenced. "All right," Julian said, his voice firm, cutting through the wail of the wind. "Vivienne, notify the broadcast team. We're going live as long as humanly possible. David, mobilize every volunteer. We need to secure everything, every cable, every piece of equipment. Alara, you stay here safe until it's time." The next hour was a blur of frantic activity, a desperate race against the clock and the encroaching tempest. Volunteers, drenched but undeterred, worked alongside the professional crew, tying down speakers, reinforcing tarps, their determination fueled by a shared sense of urgency. The wind howled, snatching at banners and sending debris skittering across the square. Rain began to fall in sheets, blurring the edges of the clock tower, turning the paved square into a glistening, treacherous expanse. Then, just as the first lightning bolt ripped across the sky, momentarily illuminating the chaos, the power flickered. The temporary lights around the stage sputtered, then died, plunging the square into a terrifying semi-darkness, punctuated only by the flashes of lightning. A collective gasp went up from the remaining crowd. "The generators!" Julian yelled, his voice strained. "Check the generators!" David and a team of volunteers raced towards the humming machines, but the rain had turned the ground into a muddy quagmire, making their progress slow and perilous. The wind whipped Julian's hair, and his expensive suit was now soaked, clinging to his frame. He looked at Ilara, who was standing on the porch, her face pale but resolute. "We're losing power, Ilara. We might not have enough for the broadcast, for the instruments." Just then, a flash of lightning illuminated a figure struggling through the downpour, pushing a heavy cart. It was Mr. Henderson, the owner of Havenwood's small, struggling electronics shop, a man known for his quiet ingenuity. On the cart was an old, battered generator, smaller than the professional ones, but still capable of providing a vital spark. "I pulled it from my shop," Mr. Henderson shouted, his voice hoarse as he reached the stage. "It's not much, but it might be enough for the piano and the main mic." A small cheer went up from the remaining crowd. It was a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness, a testament to Havenwood's refusal to surrender. Julian quickly directed the technicians to connect Mr. Henderson's generator, a last-ditch effort to keep the heart of the concert beating. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The storm raged, a relentless assault of wind and rain. The broadcast signal was intermittent, battling against the atmospheric interference. The small audience that remained, huddled under umbrellas and raincoats, looked like drowned spirits, yet their eyes held an unwavering resolve. They were not leaving. "Ilara," Julian said, his voice urgent, "we have to make a decision. The storm is worsening. We might have to call it." Ilara looked past him, through the driving rain, to the faces in the crowd. She saw Mrs. Gable shivering but still standing. She saw David soaked to the bone, but refusing to give up. She saw the collective spirit of Havenwood, bruised but not broken. And then, as if an answer from the heavens, the old Havenwood clock tower chimed, a deep, resonant peal that cut through the storm's fury, reminding them of time, of resilience, of a history that would not be silenced. "No, Julian," Ilara said, her voice clear and strong, filled with a newfound conviction. "We play, even if it's just for them." She gestured to the drenched, defiant crowd. "Even if the broadcast fails, we play for Havenwood." Julian looked at her, a profound understanding passing between them. He nodded, then turned to the stage manager, his voice ringing with authority. "Get Ms. Vance to the piano. We go live in 5 minutes. With or without the main broadcast. With or without the storm. Havenwood will be heard." As Ilara walked towards the stage, the wind ripping at her dress, the rain plastering her hair to her face, a new thought, cold and chilling, struck her. The storm felt too perfect, too devastatingly timed. Was it truly just nature's fury? Or had Sterling Industries found a way to use even the elements as their weapon, ensuring their truth remained buried, swallowed by the rising waters? And if so, how much more would they risk to silence her completely? The storm felt too perfect, too devastatingly timed. Was it truly just nature's fury? Or had Sterling Industries found a way to use even the elements as their weapon, ensuring their truth remained buried, swallowed by the rising waters? The chilling thought sent a shiver through Alara as she stepped onto the makeshift stage, the rain lashing down, mingling with the sweat of her fear and determination. The piano, a magnificent grand, was barely protected by a sagging tarp, its gleaming ebony dulled by the relentless downpour. Water streamed across the stage, forming small rivulets around her feet. The small ensemble, their instruments now muffled by plastic covers, huddled behind her, their faces grim but resolute. Julian Thorne, soaked to the bone, stood at the podium, his baton held high, a beacon of unwavering resolve against the tempest. The broadcast lights, powered by Mr. Henderson's sputtering generator, flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that made the drenched audience look like specters emerging from the storm. The main broadcast connection was still intermittent, a frustrating battle against the atmospheric interference, but the local channels were carrying the live feed, shaky though it might be. This moment was for Havenwood, first and foremost. Alara sat on the piano stool, its surface slick with rain. Her fingers, cold and stiff, hovered over the keys. The roar of the wind, the crash of thunder, the drumming of rain. It was a symphony of chaos, threatening to drown out their delicate melody of hope. Doubt, a venomous serpent, whispered in her ear, "You can't do this. They've won. You're just a small-town woman, lost in a storm engineered to silence you." Then she looked up. Through the driving rain, she saw Mrs. Gable, her face uplifted, her eyes fixed on Alara with an unwavering faith. She saw David, cheering them on, his voice swallowed by the wind, but his spirit burning bright. She saw the dozens of drenched faces huddled together, their presence a defiant act against the storm, against Sterling Industries, against despair itself. And in that moment, the doubt vanished, replaced by a fierce, burning resolve. Julian gave her a nod, then brought his baton down with a sharp, decisive movement. Alara's cold fingers descended onto the keys. The first notes of The Song of Havenwood emerged, hesitant at first, then growing in strength, battling against the onslaught of the storm. The sound was raw, vulnerable, yet infused with an indomitable spirit. The small ensemble joined in, their instruments struggling against the damp, but their combined sound was a testament to courage. The wind howled, threatening to rip the tarp from the piano, but Alara played on, her entire body swaying with the music. The rain stung her face, blurring her vision, but she saw only the notes, felt only the story pouring from her soul. The melody that had once been a quiet lament now swelled into a furious battle cry, each chord a direct challenge to the forces trying to silence them. The piano, powered by Mr. Henderson's generator, crackled at times, threatening to cut out, but Alara pressed on, her hands dancing across the keys with an almost superhuman intensity. The song told of the river, once pristine, now polluted, of the children, once healthy, now suffering, of the community, once vibrant, now fighting for its very existence. It was a mournful plea, a defiant protest, and a desperate cry for justice. Julian, his eyes fixed on Alara, conducted with a ferocity born of conviction. He pushed the ensemble, urging them to match Alara's raw emotion, to pour every ounce of their being into the performance. He was no longer the arrogant maestro. He was a conduit, a protector of a truth that demanded to be heard. As the music reached its crescendo, a powerful surge of defiance against the storm, a sudden blinding flash of lightning, struck a transformer several blocks away. The makeshift lights around the stage sputtered one last time, then died completely. The entire square was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the wild, continuous flashes of lightning and the occasional glow of a distant cell phone. A collective gasp, then a murmur of despair rippled through the audience. The generators went silent. The music stopped. The sudden silence, save for the raging storm, was deafening. It felt like the end, the final, crushing victory of Sterling Industries and the elements. But Alara didn't stop. In the darkness, guided by an instinct deeper than sight, her fingers found the keys again. The piano, somehow still alive, whispered the opening notes of a haunting, familiar melody. It was a simple, unaccompanied tune, sung by her mother, a lullaby of strength and survival. Without the electronics, her voice was the only one that mattered. She began to sing, her voice, pure and untrained, cutting through the wail of the wind and rain. It was an old spiritual, a song of resilience and unwavering hope in the face of impossible odds. The words, simple yet profound, filled the sudden void left by the silence of the instruments and the darkness of the stage. The power wasn't in the volume, but in the raw, unadorned truth of her voice. Then, from the darkness of the audience, a single voice joined in, tentative at first, then gaining strength. It was Mrs. Gable, her voice raspy with age but imbued with a lifetime of experience and faith. Then another and another. Soon, the entire drenched, freezing crowd, united in the darkness, began to sing with Alara, their voices rising above the storm, a powerful communal chorus of defiance and hope. Julian, stunned, lowered his baton. He looked at Alara, then at the singing crowd, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound emotion. This wasn't a concert anymore. It was something far more powerful. It was a spiritual awakening, a community finding its collective voice in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity. The storm raged on, but inside the circle of singing, there was a warmth, a light that no darkness could extinguish. Alara, her voice soaring, felt a surge of strength she had never known. She was not just playing for Havenwood, she was Havenwood. And as the storm threatened to turn into a full-blown flash flood, the waters of the Havenwood River, swollen and brown, began to rise ominously, threatening to engulf not just the square, but the very houses of the town, carrying with it a chilling discovery that would turn the tide of their struggle or doom them all. As the storm threatened to turn into a full-blown flash flood, the waters of the Havenwood River, swollen and brown, began to rise ominously, threatening to engulf not just the square, but the very houses of the town, carrying with it a chilling discovery that would turn the tide of their struggle or doom them all. The communal singing reached a fever pitch, a defiant human shield against the raging elements. Alara, her voice hoarse, felt a raw, invigorating power course through her. The piano, mysteriously, had fallen silent again, but the chorus of Havenwood, led by her, continued to swell, a living, breathing testament to their resilience. Suddenly, a piercing cry cut through the hymn. "Look, over there!" Everyone's gaze, including Alara's, was drawn to the swollen river that bordered the town square. The water, now dangerously high, churned with debris, branches, household items, and mud. But something else was being carried by the current, something far more sinister. A large, ruptured barrel, clearly marked with the Sterling Industries logo and a hazard symbol, bobbed violently in the swirling brown water, eventually snagging on the ancient roots of an oak tree near the riverbank. From its gaping side, a thick, viscous, unnaturally green liquid oozed into the floodwaters, tainting everything in its path. A hush fell over the singing crowd, their voices dying in their throats. The sight was horrifyingly unambiguous. It was irrefutable proof, undeniable evidence of Sterling Industries' toxic negligence, carried by the very floodwaters they claimed were purely natural. "David!" Julian shouted, his voice cutting through the sudden silence. "Get the cameras! Get it on tape! The live feed! Now!" David, who had been standing on the edge of the square, already had his phone out, frantically recording the scene. The small local TV crew, despite the weather, somehow managed to restore a shaky live signal. Their camera zooming in on the ruptured barrel, its toxic contents spilling into Havenwood's lifeline. The moment was captured, raw and undeniable for the world to see. Panic began to rise. "Evacuate!" someone shouted. "The water's rising too fast!" The ground beneath Ilara's feet was already squishy with pooling water. The makeshift stage around the clock tower, once a symbol of hope, was now becoming a perilous island. The floodwaters were creeping higher, threatening to engulf the entire square. Julian rushed to Ilara, pulling her from the piano stool. "We have to go, Ilara, now! The river's breaking its banks!" He grabbed her hand, urging her towards higher ground, towards the general store where the green room was. But Ilara pulled back, her eyes fixed on the oozing barrel. "We can't just leave it, Julian. Someone has to get a sample, proof, before the water washes it away, before Sterling denies it was ever there." "It's too dangerous, Ilara," he pleaded, his face etched with fear, not for himself, but for her. "The current is too strong. We have the video, that's enough." But Ilara was already shaking her head. The video was powerful, but a physical sample, undeniable and testable, was the nail in Sterling's coffin. She looked at David, who understood immediately. He was already searching for something, anything, to collect the sample. He spotted an empty, thick plastic water bottle lying discarded near the clock tower. "I'll go," David yelled, clutching the bottle. He sprinted towards the riverbank, ignoring Julian's frantic shouts to stop. "David, no!" Ilara cried, her heart leaping into her throat. The current was raging, debris slamming against the riverbank. It was a perilous, suicidal risk. But David, fueled by years of frustration and a burning desire for justice, was undeterred. He scrambled down the muddy bank, bracing himself against the onslaught of the water. He reached the oak tree, inching his way towards the barrel, the plastic bottle clutched in his hand. Julian stood frozen, watching in horror, unable to intervene. Ilara felt a scream tear through her throat, but it was snatched away by the wind. The entire crowd watched, horrified, as David, a beacon of raw courage, battled the raging waters. He reached the barrel, his hand shaking as he tried to maneuver the bottle into the oozing green liquid. The current tugged at him relentlessly, threatening to pull him under. He slipped, his head momentarily disappearing beneath the surface. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Gable cried out, a sound of pure anguish. David resurfaced, gasping for air, the bottle miraculously still in his hand, now filled with the vile green substance. A cheer, weak but desperate, rose from the crowd. He started to pull himself back up the muddy bank, exhausted, triumphant. But just as he reached for a protruding root, the ground beneath his feet gave way. With a sickening lurch, the bank crumbled, and David, with the precious sample, was swept away by the furious current, disappearing around the bend of the river. "David!" Ilara screamed, a primal sound of terror and despair. She started to run towards the riverbank, but Julian grabbed her, holding her back with surprising strength. "No, Ilara, you can't. The current is too strong. You'll be swept away too." His voice was ragged, desperate. The crowd erupted in frantic cries. People rushed to the river's edge, peering into the swirling waters. But David was gone. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, mixing with the tears streaming down Ilara's face. The joy of their defiant concert, the triumph of capturing the evidence, it had all turned to ash in her mouth. The local TV crew, still rolling, captured the entire horrifying scene. The raging river, the spilled chemicals, the desperate cry of the crowd, and Ilara's anguished face as her young friend disappeared. This wasn't just a story about pollution anymore. It was a human tragedy unfolding live. Julian, his face stark with grief and fury, pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. "Vivian!" he barked into the receiver. "Cancel everything! David! David has been swept away by the floodwaters, trying to retrieve a sample of Sterling's chemicals. Make sure the world knows. Every detail, every single dirty, horrifying detail." Ilara, numb with shock, could only stare at the churning river, the place where David had vanished. Her young friend, her fervent ally, had sacrificed everything for Havenwood. The concert, the battle, suddenly felt utterly meaningless without him. But as the first emergency sirens wailed in the distance, a new resolve, cold and hard as steel, began to solidify within her. David would not have died in vain. She would ensure his sacrifice became the rallying cry that brought Sterling Industries to its knees. No matter the personal cost, no matter the danger that still lurked, unseen in the rising waters and the shadows of powerful men. But even as that grim determination settled, the image of his disappearance, the silence of his loss, was a haunting echo, a premonition that their struggle was far from over and that more darkness might yet await them. But even as that grim determination settled, the image of David's disappearance, the silence of his loss, was a haunting echo, a premonition that their struggle was far from over and that more darkness might yet await them. The wail of emergency sirens grew louder, piercing the storm's fury, a stark contrast to the mournful quiet that had fallen over the Havenwood town square. First responders, their faces grim, quickly established a perimeter, guiding the shell-shocked crowd to safety as the floodwaters continued their relentless ascent. Search and rescue teams, battling the treacherous current, were immediately deployed downriver, their hopes fading with each passing minute. Ilara stood on higher ground, wrapped in a blanket someone had offered, shivering not from cold, but from profound shock. Julian stood beside her, his arm a comforting, steadying weight around her shoulders, his own face a mask of grief and impotent rage. David, their bright, tenacious David, was gone, swept away by the very injustice he fought so passionately against. The local news broadcast, now miraculously stable, played the horrifying footage on a loop. The ruptured barrel, the toxic spill, and David's courageous, fatal dive into the churning waters. The story wasn't just local anymore. It had exploded onto national and international screens. Julian Thorne, the renowned pianist, spoke live to a stunned audience, his voice thick with emotion, recounting David's bravery and Sterling Industries' culpability. He held nothing back, laying bare the decades of corporate greed and governmental apathy that had led to this tragic moment. "This is not just a natural disaster," Julian declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. "This is a man-made tragedy. My friend, David Ramirez, died tonight trying to expose the truth about Sterling Industries' criminal negligence. Havenwood has been poisoned, its people sickened, and now its children are being swept away. The world must not look away. We demand justice for David. We demand justice for Havenwood. The weight of Julian's words, amplified by his celebrity and the raw footage of David's sacrifice, sent shockwaves across the globe. Calls for investigations flooded government offices, Sterling Industries' stock plummeted, and their corporate headquarters became besieged by media and protesters. Marcus Thorne, the CEO, was forced to issue a terse, insincere statement of condolence, quickly followed by a vehement denial of any wrongdoing, blaming the flood for the barrel's displacement and dismissing David's actions as reckless. But the world wasn't buying it. In the days that followed, Havenwood became a focal point of international scrutiny. Rescue efforts for David continued, tirelessly, but hope dwindled with each passing hour. Ilara moved through a fog of grief, each familiar street, each shared memory, a fresh stab of pain. The makeshift stage around the clock tower stood partially submerged, a solemn memorial to the concert that had ended in tragedy. Julian never left her side. He canceled all his upcoming engagements, his focus entirely on Havenwood. He was no longer just an ally. He was family, bound by shared sorrow and a relentless pursuit of justice. Vivienne, Julian's formidable publicist, transformed into a grief counselor and a strategic mastermind, guiding Ilara through endless media interviews, ensuring David's story and Havenwood's plight remained at the forefront. One afternoon, a week after the flood, a search and rescue team made a grim discovery several miles downriver. It was David. His body was recovered, still clutching the plastic bottle, miraculously sealed and intact, filled with the viscous green liquid. The sample was preserved. The news ripped through Havenwood like a fresh wound. But with the grief came a powerful resurgence of resolve. David's sacrifice was not in vain. The sample was immediately sent to an independent, federally recognized lab for testing. The results, everyone knew, would either vindicate their claims or provide Sterling Industries with a final, unassailable victory. The stakes couldn't be higher. Ilara, despite her profound sorrow, felt a renewed strength. The silence of the piano in her living room, once a symbol of her buried dreams, now resonated with David's unfinished symphony. She knew what she had to do. She sought out Julian, finding him in his temporary office, a hastily rented space next to the general store, surrounded by legal documents and news reports. "Julian," she began, her voice steady, though still tinged with grief. "I want to play again. For David. For Havenwood. A memorial concert." Julian looked up, his eyes weary but understanding. "Ilara, are you sure? It's a lot to ask, emotionally." "I have to," she insisted. "This time it won't be a protest. It will be a eulogy, a testament, and a promise. We'll use the results of the lab test as our opening statement." Julian nodded slowly, a glint of resolve returning to his eyes. "All right, we'll do it. But this time, it won't be just a local event. We'll secure the biggest venue possible, a symbol of our collective voice, and the world will be watching." The second concert was planned for 3 weeks later, meticulously orchestrated by Julian and Vivienne. It wasn't in Havenwood this time, but in a grand, historic auditorium in a nearby city, large enough to accommodate the international media and thousands of supporters. The entire event was dedicated to David Ramirez, a hero who died fighting for his community. The night of the memorial concert arrived, heavy with anticipation and a palpable sense of both grief and fierce hope. The auditorium was packed to capacity. Thousands of people, from Havenwood residents to world dignitaries, united in their purpose. Before Ilara was to play, the results of the lab tests were to be announced. On stage, standing before a sea of faces, was Julian Thorne, his presence radiating both power and solemnity. Beside him stood Dr. Aris Thorne, a renowned toxicologist, no relation to Julian or Marcus. He was a man of impeccable scientific integrity, his face grave. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, a collective holding of breath. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, holding a sealed envelope. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and resonant, "the independent laboratory results for the sample retrieved by the late David Ramirez are in. The green liquid is indeed a highly concentrated industrial solvent, containing levels of known carcinogens exponentially higher than any safe threshold. Furthermore, our analysis indicates this particular compound has been actively and systematically discharged into the Havenwood River for decades, consistent with the operations of Sterling Industries and directly correlating with the rising cancer rates in the region." A collective gasp, then a wave of angry murmurs swept through the auditorium. The raw scientific truth, irrefutable and devastating, had finally been unveiled. The curtain of corporate lies had been torn apart. Sterling Industries' decades of crime were laid bare. Julian then stepped forward, his eyes flashing with righteous indignation. "Marcus Thorne, Sterling Industries, you are guilty. Guilty of poisoning an entire community, guilty of lying, and guilty of the death of a brave young man. Tonight, Havenwood, with David's sacrifice, stands vindicated, and justice finally will be served." He then turned, his gaze falling upon Ilara, who was waiting in the wings. Her heart pounded, a maelstrom of grief, triumph, and fierce resolve swirling within her. The stage was set, not just for a concert, but for a reckoning. As she walked towards the magnificent grand piano, she knew that the music she was about to play would not just be a song for Havenwood, but a powerful, unforgettable anthem for David, a symphony of justice that would reverberate across the world, but not without one final, desperate attempt by Sterling Industries to silence the truth forever, threatening to plunge them all into chaos just as Ilara's fingers prepared to touch the keys. The stage was set, not just for a concert, but for a reckoning. As Ilara walked towards the magnificent grand piano, her heart pounded, a maelstrom of grief, triumph, and fierce resolve swirling within her. The auditorium pulsed with a potent mix of anticipation and indignation. Julian Thorne had just delivered the damning indictment, and Ilara's fingers hovered above the keys, ready to deliver Havenwood's anthem. But just as her fingertips grazed the ivory, a piercing electronic shriek ripped through the air, an ear-splitting fire alarm. Simultaneously, the grand house lights flickered, then died, plunging the vast auditorium into an abrupt, unsettling darkness. A wave of startled gasps and confused murmurs swept through the crowd. This was no malfunction. It was a deliberate, brutal attempt to derail their moment of truth, to drown out the raw, unvarnished sound of justice. Panic began to rise, a suffocating presence in the sudden gloom. Ushers scrambled, flashlights cut through the darkness, pointing towards emergency exits. Marcus Thorne, Ilara instinctively knew, was behind this, his final desperate act of sabotage. Julian, ever the commander, his voice cutting through the rising tide of fear, bellowed, "Stay calm! This is a deliberate act, designed to scare you. Do not let them win." He reached for Ilara's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Ilara, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, saw the fear in the faces of the Havenwood residents, but also a flicker of renewed defiance. She remembered the storm, the rain-soaked square, the courage of her neighbors. She wouldn't let this silence them. Not again. Not after David. She pulled her hand from Julian's, not in rejection, but in a surge of independent resolve. "Julian," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "the piano, can it play acoustically?" He understood immediately. "Yes, but without amplification, only those closest will hear." "Then we play for those closest," Ilara insisted, her eyes shining with fierce purpose. "We play for Havenwood." As the panicked murmurs began to subside, replaced by a tense, expectant hush, Ilara sat at the grand piano. Julian, without a word, took his place beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The small ensemble, initially disoriented, began to find their way back to their seats, fumbling for their instruments in the darkness. Then, from the audience, a few brave souls pulled out their cell phones, their screens illuminating the stage with small, defiant glows. Soon, hundreds, then thousands, of tiny lights dotted the vast auditorium, creating a breathtaking constellation of solidarity. The stage was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of 1,000 personal lighthouses. Ilara took a deep breath, her fingers finding the keys. The first notes of "The Song of Havenwood" filled the auditorium, raw and unamplified, yet imbued with a power that transcended technology. It was softer this time, a poignant, heart-wrenching lament for David, for the years of suffering, for the innocence lost. But as the melody unfurled, it grew into a powerful, soaring testament to Havenwood's enduring spirit, a promise of renewal, a symphony of justice. Julian, his face etched with emotion, subtly guided the ensemble, their instruments now playing acoustically, blending their sound with Ilara's, creating a raw, deeply intimate performance. The lack of amplification forced every listener to lean in, to truly hear the story, to feel its unvarnished truth. Tears streamed down faces in the audience, not just from Havenwood residents, but from strangers who now understood the depth of the community's pain and their indomitable courage. The song built to a final, hopeful crescendo, a melody that sang of healing, of reconciliation, of a future where clean water flowed and children played freely. When Ilara's hands finally lifted from the keys, the last notes lingering in the air, the silence that followed was profound, absolute. Then, slowly at first, a single person began to clap, then another and another. Soon, the entire auditorium erupted in a thunderous standing ovation, a roaring tidal wave of applause, tears, and cheers that shook the very foundations of the hall. Amidst the ovation, the house lights suddenly flickered back on, and the fire alarm mysteriously ceased its shriek. But it was too late. Sterling Industries had tried to silence them, but had only amplified their voice. In the aftermath, the consequences for Sterling Industries were swift and severe. The overwhelming public outcry, fueled by the lab results and the powerful imagery of David's sacrifice and Ilara's concert, forced immediate government action. Marcus Thorne and several high-ranking executives were arrested, indicted on charges of environmental crime, corporate negligence, and reckless endangerment. Their multi-billion-dollar empire crumbled, facing massive fines and a barrage of lawsuits. The Havenwood Renewal Fund, spearheaded by Julian Thorne, swelled with donations from around the world, ensuring that the town had the resources to heal, to rebuild, and to provide medical care for its affected residents. Ilara Vance, the quiet woman who had once abandoned her dreams, was transformed. She became an international voice for environmental justice, her music a powerful anthem for communities fighting similar battles. She performed in concert halls across the globe, always dedicating her performance to David, always telling the story of Havenwood. Julian Thorne, true to his word, became her staunchest supporter and collaborator. Not just her mentor, but her partner in a shared mission. Their professional bond had deepened into a profound, unspoken connection, a quiet understanding born of shared struggle and mutual respect, hinting at a future that held not just music, but perhaps a quieter, more personal harmony. Months later, Ilara stood by the newly cleaned banks of the Havenwood River, its waters running clearer than they had in decades. The Sterling Industries plant lay in ruins, awaiting demolition. The old clock tower, repaired and repainted, stood proudly in the town square, a symbol of resilience. Mrs. Gable, her grandson now showing signs of recovery, sat beside her, a gentle smile on her face. Julian joined them, placing a hand on Ilara's shoulder. "It's a new beginning, isn't it?" he said, his gaze sweeping over the revitalized town. Ilara nodded, her eyes welling with quiet tears, a mixture of joy and lingering sorrow for David. "It is, but the scars will always be there, a reminder of what we fought for." Julian squeezed her shoulder, and a reminder of how powerful one voice, one song, one community can truly be. He then gestured towards her cottage, where the old upright piano, repaired and lovingly restored, sat on her porch. It wasn't the grand piano from the concert halls, but it was her piano, the one that had cradled her earliest dreams and witnessed her deepest sorrows. Ilara smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that reached her eyes. The melody of Havenwood, the song of justice, the memory of David, would continue to echo. And in the quiet strength of her own heart, Ilara knew that the music, finally, had brought her home. The story of Havenwood, a testament to the enduring human spirit, was far from over. It had just found its true, resonant voice, promising a future shaped by the echoes of an unbroken melody, forever changed, forever hopeful. What an extraordinary journey we've shared, unraveling the soul-stirring tale of Ilara Vance and the unbreakable spirit of Havenwood. This story reminds us that even in the darkest of storms, a single, courageous voice can become a symphony of defiance. It teaches us about the profound strength of community, the unwavering resolve of those who refuse to be silenced, and the quiet heroism of individuals like David, whose sacrifice ignited a flame of justice that no corporation could extinguish. Ilara's journey, from buried dreams to global advocacy, shows us that true talent isn't just about skill, but about the truth it carries, the lives it touches, and the change it inspires. And in Julian Thorne, we witness the beautiful possibility of redemption, of a heart awakening to a purpose far greater than personal acclaim. Havenwood reminds us that hope, even when battered, always finds a way to rise, painting new dawns after the longest nights. If this powerful story resonated with your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to bringing you more meaningful, emotionally rich stories like Ilara's every single day. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep believing in the power of your own voice.